Hello and very welcome to the No Drama Dharma podcast. William Edelglass, I'm so happy to meet you in person or let's say on screen and to have a chat about philosophy in Buddhism, philosophy in the West, and maybe about how different viewpoints underlying meditation practices actually can be conducive or not so conducive for meditation practice, how we can also reflect upon the influences of religious traditions such as Christianity, Judaism into meditation practice because meditation practice is associated and largely with the religious domain. But if we look at the philosophical domain, we might also see that Western philosophy plays a big part in the understanding or in the filter of understanding of Buddhism, for example, and of Buddhist practice. And as you're a scholar and specialist in both, so glad to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marco. And I really appreciate your project of exploring the intersection of practice and scholarship, which I think is very much in line with classical Buddhist traditions, as well, I think was with many philosophical traditions in the West, going back to the Greeks.
When I read your CV, it's very obvious that you have this stronghold in the Western philosophy, and now you're director of studies for the Barre Center of Buddhist Studies in Massachusetts. So I think it could make you an ideal person to discuss these things. And as always, we try to not go just by the subject we have. We try to see who is interesting in the field of Buddhist practice, in the field of Buddhist knowledge or contemplative knowledge as a whole. That's really my interest for our talk today. But this is not scripted. It's not meant to be scripted. It's not meant to be presenting a paper. It's meant to be a discussion and it's meant to be open so that our listeners and viewers they can just see whatever comes up in this discussion spontaneously.
Great. I look forward to it.
Yeah. Gets me to the point when um we do have Buddhist practice and if we look at practice, for me, it can be understood also as a craft, as something that is in the doing of it. And within the domain of study, studying the doing sometimes can be very, very strange. Or studying the writing upon doing. I think it's like if you're a builder and you have the simple task of driving a nail into a wall, then the doing of driving a nail into the wall might not really be the same as explaining to somebody how and why the nail is driven into the wall. And you could do a lot of calculations how with different leverages and Newton meters, etc., you would need the equation to drive the nail into the wall, but still it wouldn't enable you to do that. So I think this ambiguity in the pure study of Buddhism or of philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, might be the same, that will not enable the full understanding of the craft without actually, yeah, discussing the craft also from the part of view of the doing.
So I think you're right, Marco, that there's a way in which meditation practice is a skill or a doing, not unlike, say, riding a bike. If you say to someone, do you know how to ride a bike? And they say yes, what we mean is that they can get on a bike and ride it, as opposed to they can explain the physics and the biomechanics of riding a bike. I think there is a way in which meditation is like riding a bike in some sense. At the same time, when we learn how to ride a bike, it's very much about learning this bodily skill and not learning the cognitive elements of riding a bike or the physics or biomechanics. And in meditation, in contrast, there is a way in which we learn a lot, one can say cognitively. A conceptual world is developed that supports Buddhist practice or supports Buddhist meditation to such a degree that I think for most classical Buddhist traditions, and there's some exceptions, Vipassana, Dzogchen, sometimes Zen, um, but historically, one studied a certain amount of philosophy before one started meditating. So one learned, say, Abhidhamma before doing Theravada meditation so that one could understand what one was actually experiencing in one's meditation and meditate more skillfully. And so in some ways, I think meditation, yes, is like riding a bike. It's a skill that is understood as something we do that is not simply a cognitively informed process. Oh, I know this, so I do this. Rather, it's a little bit like riding a bike. I ride the bike, and to do the meditation is to perform this skill. At the same time, when we do it, it's informed by a lot of thinking, I would say.
Hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right in this. And maybe I was too non-conceptual in my introduction, as I wanted to make this point. At the same time, when we are, or when people are going through this process of study, it's very aligned with the practice that is to come. As you mentioned, the study of Abhidharma is aligned with, you might say, the practice of Theravada and practice maybe of Anapanasati, etc. But for each system, you also have an aligned field of study.
Yes.
And as I'm mostly acquainted with the Tibetan Kagyupa Mahamudra and Nyingma Dzogchen systems of practice, of course, there are also fields of study closely aligned that form the pond in that you swim, or
Yes.
that form the environment and that lead to a certain conducive mental environment for these experiences to arise in. And
Yes.
when we look at secular mindfulness practices, of course, these spaces are not established in the same way. There might be some guidelines, like some ethical advices, or because it's a very open space, it's not defined as such, and often it
Mhm.
should not be defined. But that leads me also to the question, when meditation contemplation is done without a view, without such an established view, if the tool alone can bring certain result.
Yes, that is a very significant question, especially in the Tibetan context. Um, and I tend to be more sympathetic to secular, what people think of as secular Buddhism, than some other people I know. And I tend to think, well, there are 84,000 Dharma gates, and there's an entry into the Dharma that looks different for many different people. And it may be the case that the having a different view, say, for example, having the view that I want to make my life and my experience a little less stressful, is enough of a view to help one become a little less stressful. And as one becomes a little less stressful, one becomes perhaps kinder and more open to the experience of others and more attentive to the ways in which one might be reacting more than responding to others. And and so that view may go along with that particular goal. It's also the case that I have met people who have started meditation on the meditation apps and have had deep, deep, profound, very, very powerful experience through the meditation apps. And I've had conversations with people who had no idea what was possible and what was coming and what could happen, and didn't really understand what was happening until they connected with a teacher who could help them understand. And so I think even in a secular context, say using a meditation app without a larger view of, say, the kind of view that one might have with Mahamudra or Dzogchen, or classical Theravada understanding of jhanas, or a contemporary Theravada understanding of jhanas, that one can enter into these states, very, very, very deep states.
It's a good point you make. I see you coming more from what's useful, what's beneficial for people actually. And
You know, it's interesting. There are a lot of scholars who are very critical of secular Buddhism or Buddhist modernism, or ways in which the mindfulness industry or McMindfulness. And I also, and there's a completely legitimate critique of the way in which mindfulness is being exploited for commercial gains. It's being commodified and commercialized, and it's being employed in ways that one perhaps ought to feel wary of, the ways in which corporations maybe are teaching mindfulness to pacify, if you will, their employees. On the other hand, thinking of the term you just used of what's useful, what's beneficial, I also know plenty of very traditional Buddhist monastics who feel like, well, if these secular practices, or this kind of widespread mindfulness practice is helping people alleviate suffering and becoming more mindful of their own mind and the way in which they're responding to others, that is deeply dharmic. That's what the Buddha was interested in. And so I tend to I tend to lean in that direction, even as I understand that there are issues of cultural appropriation and I think a misunderstanding of what Buddhism is, to think that one could simply take meditation out of Buddhism as if that's the heart of Buddhism and nothing else counts. So there's a lot there. We could unpack some of that if you want, but yes, I am
that's
interested in a more pragmatic orientation.
it's a very interesting road we could go. Yeah. It's I mean, my job here anyhow as the discussion partner is not to have a fixed view on things, you know, it's more
Uh,
um try to engage in the discussion of these aspects because they are so relevant in our time. And there are these different positions, and also I think there are different way people would say secular Buddhism starts. Depending on each and every person speaking about it, they would draw the line slightly different at which moment they would define the start of secular Buddhism and then non-Buddhist secular meditation practices or non-secular Buddhism. And all of this, I think, is very interested in the cultural transfer that is happening now. And also there's a view upon Buddhist practices to me that puts into question there is definitely a cultural transformation that is happening between cultures, but Buddhism can be seen as a philosophical or wisdom tradition, or can it be seen as a cultural tradition of a part of the world that is really appropriated by another part? And there I would heavily lean into the first statement. I don't think that the Tibetan Buddhism I know from Tibet would belong to Tibetans as such. There's lots of Tibetan aspects, but the bigger part of Tibetan teachers I know would also not side along with this being a Tibetan tradition that needs to belong to Tibetans. I know there are other Tibetan teachers who would go that route, but I tend to think that this is also part of the global treasure of mankind.
Yes. And the Buddha says to his disciples, go out and share the Dharma and don't go together. That is, go as widely as you can and speak in whatever vernacular languages that are necessary for people to understand. So don't keep it in one sacred language. Teach the Dharma in the languages of the people you find, in their idiom, in their ways of thinking. And so, yes, Buddhism is a proselytizing tradition in that sense. And so I agree with you. I think the cultural appropriation bit is to say the critique about cultural appropriation, as I understand it, is to say that meditation is the heart of Buddhism. Everything else is so-called cultural trappings, pilgrimage, ritual, um, art, what have you. And we don't need those forms. We can just take the meditation. And that's what's most transformative and powerful about Buddhism. And we can then teach that in a way that conforms to our cultural norms and not other cultural norms. And I think I don't have any problem with people doing mindfulness practice in a secular format. But I do think it's a misunderstanding of Buddhism to leave everything else out. I think practices like pilgrimage, study, um, ethics, ritual, art, all of that is just as important in Buddhism as meditation is. And it's interesting. Where I work at the Barre Center for Buddhist Studies, what we do is we integrate practice and study. So we want everything that we offer to include practice, but also study that is related to that practice. And the practice and the study are integrated. So we were started by Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg to give a place to serious meditators and longer term meditators who were doing retreat after retreat, but not really understanding the history or the deeper relationship, having a deeper relationship with textual study that could support their practice.
Yeah.
You know?
I see this quite often when, at least from my experience in the Kagyu tradition, that coming from Asia, you can say, from Tibet, the institutions for study and practice had been separated. And people devoted to it might have stayed at one institution before going to the other institution. But when coming to the West, there are time constraints, there are resources not present, and then either one or the other branch does not get established. And this intersection of the two branches of you can have say She and Drup of
Mm.
study and practice doesn't happen so much at one place because you either in one branch or the other.
Yeah.
And coming back to the Tibetan traditions, often the curricula of study are so extensive because they were drawn up for, you might say, hardcore scholars that often they don't offer a proper set of instructions of topics put together in a way that they serve as a support for the application, but they rather form like a whole study by themselves for many years. So for generally for Western practitioners tends to be too much. I mean,
Yeah.
very few are having the capacity and the resources to actually follow such a path of study then also. So I think
Yes.
nowadays some Tibetan teachers are trying to provide modernized or essentialized study paths, but often I think it's still in the making. That's part of the transfer of this tradition, for example.
Yes. And I think there's also an exploration of, in the study, what other areas of study would be appropriate for contemporary practice, in addition to whatever might have been a classical Tibetan curriculum. Mingyur Rinpoche, for
Hmm.
example, now with the Turgar Institute in Nepal, well, he's doing this 3-year training that includes some classical Tibetan curricula, but also subject matters that would be part of the contemporary world, psychology or business organization or education that can then be integrated with a Buddhist education.
Yeah.
So I think it is a moment of creativity right now where other, like Maitripa College in Portland or Naropa College, places where um, there is a classical Tibetan education that is being offered in a contemporary Western context together with modern knowledge.
When you say modern knowledge, this also, I mean, brings me back to your education as a scholar of Western philosophy. Do you think to bridge cultures and also to avoid abstraction within people, like having to jump cultures, having to jump all ideas, you think it is possible to draw upon Western philosophy when doing contemplative practices, meditation practices from the Buddhist environment? I think there's some benefit in that.
I think as contemporary Buddhist practitioners, we are always already informed by contemporary thought and by Western thought. And let me just say that sometimes in some Buddhist contexts, one might hear a certain disparaging of Western philosophical traditions. And when I say Western philosophical traditions, the term the West or Western is a complicated term, but broadly, I mean what has been constructed as the West from the Greeks through the Romans, through the Renaissance in Western Europe, which of course is a highly selective version of what we mean by the West. But throughout that tradition, philosophy was always intertwined with contemplative practice in many instances. So some of the listeners are probably familiar with Pierre Hadot's book, Spiritual Exercises from Socrates to Foucault. And Greek philosophy and Roman philosophy was very much about contemplative practice, spiritual practice. From a Tibetan perspective, we might think of as mind training, exercises to help us be more patient, be more understanding, not be afraid of death, as well as contemplating the forms for Socrates or Plato or other forms of contemplation with Aristotle and other Hellenistic thinkers. So there is this tradition, it continues on in Christian and Jewish philosophy. And I think that these traditions and Christian traditions, Western religious traditions, have deep, deep, deep contemplative practices and contemplative practice traditions within them. So I just want to say that at the outset. And I think that there is there are several ways in which Western thinking or Western thought or Western traditions can inform us as contemporary Buddhists. One is just thinking about drawing on the resources of, say, psychology or cognitive science. And I think there's much resonance with Buddhism here, but ways in which we often don't actually understand ourselves or our own experience, ways in which um, social psychology, for example, tells us that we are conditioned by things that we do not understand. I think that resonates deeply with Buddhism. And if we are informed by that, I think that can be beneficial. I think as you and I living um, in a world that is deeply impacted by colonialism and say the history of colonialism, understanding that can help us be more ethical. And to the degree that we think of ethics as a Buddhist practice, that's important. Similarly, thinking about race and gender and class and these sorts of things, which Buddhist traditions didn't think a whole lot about. Um, they thought about it to some degree, but not to the same extent. And I think to the degree that we think about ethical engagement in the world as Buddhist practice, which I do, those ways of thinking are important to inform and help us understand what ethical practice is. With regards to actual contemplative practice, say mindfulness practice, can Western thought help us there? Plenty of people did mindfulness practice in classical Asian Buddhist traditions without Western thought, and I think it worked just fine. And I do think that, say, traditions like the 20th century tradition of European phenomenology can be helpful. That is, it can help give very persuasive contemporary conceptual frameworks for, say, observing the rising of thoughts and feelings and sensations that one might do in a Vipassana practice. I don't know that it's necessary, and it's not something that I would recommend, but I think it can be helpful. And
Yeah.
I guess I want to say that thinking of Vipassana traditions prior to the 19th century and Lady Sayadaw in Burma, people would study Abhidhamma for 7 years before they started meditating. And that was because the idea was you had to have the Abhidhamma categories to understand what was experiencing in one's meditation. And I think we are always already bringing thoughts or conceptual frameworks to our practice. Conceptual frameworks of what is the self, what is thinking, what's emotion, what is affects, what are sensations in the first place. And I think to the degree that one can study philosophy and Western philosophy, one can become conscious of the conceptual frameworks that one is bringing into one's practice.
That got me really curious because I only know the way Tibetans study Abhidharma. If they're aspiring scholars, they learn sections by heart of the Abhidharma Kosha lists. And
Yes.
I always wondered what they do with it because there is no explanations giving as how to relate this to yourself. So you're basically left to figure it out for yourself or to jump to the next topic. But in, let's say, a living tradition, I would say, of the Abhidharma, how is it done? How is Abhidharma drawn upon? You most likely don't just read the catalog of different mental functions and learn them by heart.
So I think different people draw on them differently. I think some in the Theravada tradition do what you're talking about. I don't know if you know the scholar Maria Heim. She's a professor at Amherst who's a wonderful, wonderful interpreter of Buddhaghosa. And the way she thinks of the Abhidhamma is very much as a phenomenological support. So what these lists do is that they help us cultivate a more sensitive, more nuanced attention to our own experience. Like children, maybe there's a sense of happiness or sadness or anger or joy. But our vocabulary for emotions or feelings or affects tends to be relatively narrow, relatively circumscribed. And what the lists do, what the lists can do, is by naming them, by naming a greater variety of mental states, allows us to become more attentive to the nuance of the mental state that we might actually be experiencing, and thereby supports us in becoming more attentive to what is actually going on in our minds, or to how we're experiencing what is going on in our minds. And so, one way of working with those categories is just to think about them as helpful pointers to our dimensions of our own experience that allow us to become more skillful. Just like if you walk through the woods and you might only know, oh, that's a hardwood tree and that's an evergreen tree. But if you learn, oh, that's a beech and that's an oak and that's a hemlock and that's a fir and that's a white pine, you begin to see much more. And so understanding that list and being able to recognize subtle differences in our own consciousness, in our own life, in our subjective experience is it's like walking through the woods and being able to recognize all the different plants and all the different trees. And one just has a much more refined attunement to one's own experience, and it can support one's meditation in that respect.
But that also means that those lists are in some way easier to understand by its wording, or are they discussed more upon among practitioners? For
Um,
example, list of the 51 mental events that is largely studied in the Tibetan tradition. Most of these mental events are named in such abstract way that it's very difficult to actually make any sense of them. And in practical experience, it's easy to like see what the Sanskrit is, etc. But I wonder if in the living tradition of Abhidharma, there's a way also how these are, yeah, transmitted, discussed.
I think in the West, there's very little of that. There's all this movement towards what people call early Buddhism. And a lot of that leaves behind the Abhidhamma. People are less interested in the Abhidhamma because they think it's too abstract. So the number of people working with Abhidhamma in the way that I described, I think is pretty small in the West.
Mhm.
I do think there are places in Southeast Asia where people are doing that kind of thing. There are different interpretations of what, in the Theravada context, what these lists are referring to. Are they referring to stable ontological natural kinds, or are they referring to phenomenologically experienced qualities of the mind that are not necessarily ontological kinds? And South Asian traditions don't really have a term for emotion the way we do. Emotion is a modern term. And this is one way in which I think careful textual study can be really helpful in meditation, because if you're a Westerner, you bring with you, we all bring with us the conceptual frameworks that are embedded in our culture. And there are some ways in which that conceptual framework is shared by, say, Indian and Tibetan Buddhist thinking, and there are other ways in which it's not. And so textual study discloses where there are places which problematize or pose questions to how we think about our own experience. We're so used to thinking about emotions as a kind of separate realm from cognition or behavior, but Buddhists typically do not think that way. For Buddhists, it's much more integrated.
When you say early Buddhism, you mean reconstructed early Buddhism? Or
So what's very popular, I think, like if you are on Sutta Central, the Bhikkhu Sujata's site, which is very, very helpful in so many ways. It's a really remarkable website. Or Bhikkhu Analayo and many, many other people who have come out of the Theravada tradition or Gil Fronsdal, people also in the Insight tradition who talk about early Buddhism. The way they want to typically think about it is a Buddhism that predates Buddhism as a religion and is a more basic set of practices of mindfulness. So there's a lot of attention to the Satipatthana Sutta, to Anapanasati, to a to texts which do not have a lot of supernatural or larger metaphysical phenomena going on. There's not a whole lot of attention to the Jataka tales or things which are regarded as later developments or as non-Buddhist texts which were later incorporated. And I think for people who are more sophisticated in how they think about it, like Biko Inalyo, he is very clear that this is, in fact, to use your term, a reconstruction. There are no early Buddhists alive today. Early Buddhism is something that happened a long time ago, and you can't really describe yourself, or you shouldn't describe yourself as an early Buddhist practitioner because you're not an early Buddhist. That said, there are many people who do think of themselves as early Buddhist practitioners, as if they could be doing what Buddhists in the first 100 or 200 years of Buddhism did.
Maybe it's the everlasting search for the original purity of things that got stained on the way.
Yes.
Like you have the same thing like you have in language studies where even today there's still a tiny bit of ideological um, superstition to find the original source of something that later got corrupted by men, by their
Yes.
corrupted experience. And if you would go back to the purity, you have it safe.
And as it happens in this context, when you go back to the origins, what is often disclosed is a form of Buddhism that is very similar to, or that resonates with contemporary Western views about, well, metaphysical views that don't include what is regarded as religious, all the bodhisattvas and the deities and all the things that are then associated with Buddhism as a religion in the minds of some people. So it's a kind of it ends up not always, but it can end up as a kind of close kin to something more like secular mindfulness. And of course, all these terms, secular mindfulness, Buddhist modernism, they're different terms and they refer to different things, many different things, and it takes time to unpack all these terms.
Even in, for example, in Dzogchen, you have, which is a very, you might say, a rather late system of practice. You have people nowadays, and especially Western, trying to go back to the origin of Dzogchen and trying to not align with the latest developments of practices, but going back to the earliest version they can trace. And even though they are not practiced in the same way by the traditions or kept alive in the same way, there's also this wish to go back to the pure origin. And I always thought, what's so bad with the current development, Because the current development is the development of the people that are actually present, that actually have a present alive experience and
Yes.
that are able to report what's going on instead of trying to reconstruct the people who have engaged in a practice like 800 or 2000 years ago.
I think to the degree that we say that original Buddhism is the true or the authentic Buddhism, we make many mistakes. One is we discount what the vast majority of Buddhists have taken to be Buddhism. We discount that as really Buddhism, and we think they are fundamentally misguided. And it's also the case that from a purely historical perspective, we don't know what the Buddha actually said. We don't know what texts are attributable to the Buddha. I think, we could probably say what the Buddha didn't say, but amongst the thousands of suttas that are in the collection of discourses of the Buddha, in the Chinese agamas that are translated from Sanskrit or the Pali canon or any other sources that we have, we can't really know what exactly the Buddha said. So the search for origins is um, is understandable, but I personally find it liberating to recognize that there is no one stable origin that we can have. There is no one set of texts that are definitively from the Buddha. And the reason I find that is liberating is that it requires a certain amount of faith. And it forces us to recognize that faith is playing a role in what we do and that that is okay. And there's not a way to rationally somehow circumvent the role of faith. And it may be even to the degree that faith is necessary, it's also necessary for in secular Buddhism. It may be the case that you don't have faith in Buddhas and bodhisattvas and wrathful deities, but you have faith in the way that Buddhists have often conceived of faith, and that is faith in the practice to be transformative, faith in the capacity, in my own capacity to cultivate something through practice, faith in some basic Buddhist doctrines, faith perhaps in the fact that some people have made progress on the path. Um, and so, yeah, I find it liberating that there is no historical fact that somehow allows us to say, oh, this is definitively the words of the Buddha. Rather, what is open to a living tradition of practices that have been meaningful to people over time. And as practices have no longer been meaningful, they've dropped away or they're transformed, and that's what we inherit. And now we take those up and we care for them and cultivate the contemporary field of practice and meditation and Buddhism, and the people who come after us will take it up in their turn.
So it's really wonderful how you're expressing this.
And I also think the culture in North America is different and it's changing. I think 30 years ago, there was much more of a sense of if you're an academic, don't talk about your practice. But that's changed now. Many more academics are much more open about being practitioners today than they were, say, a generation ago. So this is inspired by something Anne Klein said, and it's how I've been thinking about meditation recently, that when I am meditating, I'm essentially cultivating a field that I am part of. And when I'm meditating in a Dharma hall with others, together we're cultivating a field. And that field is part of a larger field that includes the trees around us, the plants around us, the earth, the buildings, the land, the cars. Um, and it includes other Dharma centers and other people, whether they're Buddhist or not, that we live in a shared set of overlapping fields. And meditation is the way I've been thinking about it. Meditation is simply cultivating this field, caring for the field, and caring for the field as I am part of that field in myself and also elsewhere.
You have given really wonderful presentations for clarifying also points that I have almost no knowledge about, like the Abhidharma in the Eastern tradition, etc. This for me is really, really interesting. And I feel this has been a wonderful podcast. So
Oh,
thank you
great.
very much.
Well, thank you so much, Marco, for inviting me.
Thank you so much.